So thank you all so much for joining again for this second session in second session, second week. Last week we did developing a humane long-term culture. Now we're on to kind of like talking about how can we help very specifically and quite practically human well-being along by advancing high-impact science and technology. Yesterday we started off with investment and philanthropy, and it was really quite fantastic. We already honestly covered a lot of how we can kind of like spearhead science and tech from an investor standpoint. Today, I'm super happy to kind of like tackle that problem from a different lens. I'm really happy to be joined by four really quite fantastic panelists. Melanie, about you first. Maybe Lou, if you find Melanie's salon for Foresight, maybe you can post it. Melanie has not only been a really fantastic friend, but also really like a kind of like a stellar example to watch. I think Prellis has like risen incredibly really over the last few years. It's fantastic what you have been doing there with the team, and it's really nice how you update folks on like how science looks from the inside. So I encourage you to follow Melanie if you haven't done so already. And Melanie last week has done no, not last week, but in the sanity preservers, which was which is what the HiveMind grew out of. She's done a really fantastic talk on what Prellis is up to for helping COVID-19. And during that talk, referenced a lot of ways in which actually some of the red tape that has been somewhat restrictive in advancing high impact science has been cut recently. So I'm really happy to have her here, and I'm hoping we'll get some kind of like frontline insights from her in vaccine development. And similarly so, Melanie, I'm going to unmute you just so you know, similarly so for John Lewis, who has also been really at the forefront. John actually gave a talk at a longevity meeting that we had just before COVID didn't allow us to have any meetings anymore. And I think maybe we can even find that talk of you there. But you have since then really kind of like spearheaded efforts in trying to set up systems in which we can really advance the treatment of COVID-19. And similarly, in your Foresight Salon, you were also touching on all the ways in which suddenly you're able to act much faster and much more aligned with the speed that high impact science ought to be progressing if we were actually serious about making progress and curing folks. So I'm super happy to hear from you guys from the front line a little bit. Then we also have Robin Hanson here. Robin, thank you so much for joining. I just unmuted you. And Robin has been vicariously posting on overcoming bias and on a few kind of like really quite incredible analyses of I guess like lesser talked about topics in this crisis. I encourage you to check out Overcoming Bias. I think you update it quite frequently. You had a Foresight talk on virulation or considering deliberate exposure here, which maybe we can post as well. And actually it was really interesting because we then afterwards had Dan Tillett talk about a variance of deliberate exposure, which is basically going out and exposing, or like for young folks, exposing yourself deliberately, then going under quarantine, and then slowly entering the workforce again. And then Dan Tillett, in his later sanity preserver, took it one step further and actually talked about exposing yourself with, let's say, more benign strands of COVID-19 and seeking those out. So it was really interesting that we had this very kind of like really quite progressive the development of those early ideas going on. So thanks for joining. And lastly, Jim O'Neill. I think you popped out of my mosaic window, but I'll find you and unmute you too. Jim, I'm really happy that we finally got you. You were a hard one to catch. I think we scheduled two talks with you in the sanity preservers, and you were so busy doing COVID-19 related work that you always kind of like had to drop those, and I think even for the better. Like if we don't want to do one thing, then it's like holding people up who are actually trying to kind of like do their best on the front lines from actually doing those things. But nevertheless, I'm really, really happy that you can join today. I'm terribly excited for your input. You haven't only been kind of a CEO of SENS now for a little bit, which is, definitely an organization that's close to the heart of many of us here. But, before that, you have really spearheaded efforts at Teal, and you have really kind of like brought some really kind of like new progressive wind into government. So I'm really happy that you have this kind of like tripart view from which we're hoping to get a lot out of you today when we discuss how the current COVID-19 crisis can develop, can accelerate high impact science by cutting some of the red tape that we were worried about. Okay, great. So with that being said, thank you so much, all of you, to joining. I'm hoping we have quite an interactive discussion today. For everyone who is participating, please feel free to collect questions already. We're definitely going to try to reserve the last 15 to 10 minutes for questions from all of you guys. Please mark the question with a big Q so I can like scroll up and unmute you when it's time. And feel free to use the chat really widely. That being said, I do want to beg you at this point to please, I'm sharing the collaborative Google Notes with you. Please, 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 if anything that you want to go into the report later, rather than just an informal chat conversation, please add it to the collaborative notes doc as well, because I would love for this chat to be like a super informal way in which people can just interact with each other. Like some of this can, be like a more informal channel that, doesn't have to be perfect. But then please, everything that ought to go into a report, please answer all the questions that I'll be asking the panelists yourself on the collaborative Google Docs. Okay, cool. With that being said, let's start into today's questions. And maybe we can talk a little bit about, let's see. Oh, I think I posted the wrong document from yesterday. We don't live in the past. So I'm going to pull up the right doc so you can take notes on this session. I think I sent it out yesterday to many of you. So, and you've also all been contributing to this already. So let's see. Also, what I would love for you guys to do, Lou just posted it, that's great. And what I'd love for you guys to do, what we've been trying to do in our program is create one column in which we collect very specific action items. So the last questions to all of you speakers, I'm already preparing you for it, will be if there's one thing that participants do after the session, how could they have the most influence in holding those doors open that have now been opened with COVID-19. So those action items we're going to try to compile on the column. So if you have any cool action items that also pop up during the session that people actually in this workshop could be doing, then please feel free to add them to the doc. All the way in the bottom, I'm going to add one on action items. And please collect there, and then I'm going to add them to the Google program. Okay, great. So, wow, we have a lot of contributions already. That's amazing. So let's start with you, Jim. I already kind of mentioned you have been wearing many hats over your career, and maybe from your experience with Teal Capital and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and now as CEO of SENS, could you maybe give a little bit of an introduction on what you hold from your own experience to be the role division generally between government versus private efforts to accelerate high impact science? You are now unmuted.
Great, thank you. I think in general, the private sector, both for-profit and nonprofit, can do much more effective basic and translational research than government can. So if I could sort of suggest what I think needs to change between the relationship between the private sector and government, most of what I would advocate would be government getting out of the way. Getting out of the way of innovation, getting out of the way of new drugs and tests, getting out of the way of end-to-end encryption, getting out of the way of the practice of medicine, which unfortunately a lot of governors have been distorting in the past few months. That would be 80% of what I would change. The other 20% would be focused on areas where the government actually can provide tremendous value, and that is mostly in funding research, which it does a lot of, but not always in the right way. So the major science funding organizations like NIH and NSF and a lot of state level funding organizations are bureaucracies, and they behave like bureaucracies, and people in them play natural human power and status games. And I don't blame them for that, but I do blame the organization, the way that things are organized. So it would be possible to give them a lot more effect if you could make a few reforms on the level of changing the level of abstraction. So just in the case of NIH, which I know the best, it's very, very siloed into more than 25 separate institutes, which are all competing with each other on budgets and have their own separate cultures, and therefore tend to treat every single disease as a very, very separate research area, which is not really how the human body works, and also not how science ought to work. So you have way too much siloing. Just to take two examples, the National Institute of Drug Abuse and the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse are both studying the science of addiction, but they're totally separate institutes. That makes no sense. I actually got very, very close to merging them when I was helping to run HHS 15 years ago. Got kind of sabotaged by the drug czar's office and some other entities in the White House. But that's one example of siloing. Another is the way aging is handled. Aging is not just a disease, it is the source of most diseases, and it really ought to be studied that way. That's what we do at SENS Research Foundation, and that's what NIH ought to do.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, tomorrow we have Aubrey on from SENS, who will definitely do a deep dive into the aging topic, and we already touched about it yesterday with the folks from Apollo, and how this is like an investment opportunity that, really there's now a really good narrative to be funding more of that. And I think it's also close to the heart of many of the other panelists here. I think thanks, Jim. John, Melanie, or Robin, if you want to chime in there, raise your hand and then I'll unmute you. Okay, Melanie. And also to the panelists, please keep yourself unmuted, because then you can just speak, because you can't unmute yourselves. I will have to do it, or always raise your hand. Okay, Melanie, what's your answer?
Yeah, I think Jim took the words right out of my mouth. My experience as a researcher prior to starting this company is that we have tremendous silos built up in research, and it's difficult to get funding for cross-collaborative projects or novel things that are kind of taking a step forward and moving research forward beyond the simple basic science. And I think to accelerate things like finding an antibody or a vaccine for something like COVID-19, we really need to be able to have flexibility in moving our research forward. So I'm in full agreement with that in my experience.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think the cross collaboration one and the cross kind of like the cross-disciplinary one is one that, we hope to always be bridging with our technical competitions, where we bring different scientists from different silos in, because otherwise there's really no incentive, or not even a possibility, right? They're actively being restricted from doing cross-disciplinary work. It's insane.
That's right. You're siloed and you're narrowly focused, and you're in your small area of research, and sharing that knowledge can accelerate things quite quickly when you start to bring in hardware, physics development, whatnot. It can move quite quickly if we remove a lot of those kind of barriers and gates.
Yeah. Do you have a specific example there, what you would do? Like, I think Jim had this 80-20 rule that he just mentioned. Is there like a specific agency that you'd like, or?
Well, I haven't come up with any specifics on that exactly. I think my company is a good example, because we do combine hardware and physics engineering with tissue engineering and development. And my experience in building that company and looking around at the landscape of tissue engineering is that A lot of people have approached it from a chemical basis, a cellular biology basis, even a mechanical bioprinting basis, but people don't have the wherewithal to understand the depth of knowledge in each one of those fields and bring them together collaboratively to actually move them forward. And so even within my own team, we have PhDs from optical engineers all the way out to cell biologists, and getting them to think cross-functionally has been a major goal for us. And I think it's why we've been able to move our technology forward so quickly. And I think there are a lot of good examples out there.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I think John wanted to take that question as well. And then Robin, you're next.
No, this is a really interesting thread. So, I mean, I live two lives as well. I've been a professor of oncology for a long time, and I've been an entrepreneur, being involved in about 6 different companies. I'll have to say, on the academic side, I've always tried to focus on developing platform technologies and then trying to apply them to patients. And the way the system is set up through NIH, through NSF, and other funding avenues, it's not practical. And so what I've become so frustrated with a good example is number one, we have silos, and each institute has its own personality. And then the peer review that goes on for these grants really rewards you for, number one, incremental research, but number two, really just adding on to what other ideas that are already out there, because you don't upset anybody. So I found, actually, on the academic side, philanthropy has played a huge role in being able to fund outside of the box ideas and research. And again, on the private side, we have a lot more flexibility to be able to take really compelling science and drive it forward towards some sort of goal that's going to impact patients.
Awesome, thanks. Robin, what's your verdict?
I'd say in general, government is not very good at innovation. That is, most innovation happens outside of government, and government tends to copy it. The kind of innovation that government does is the kind where they can lean on an existing prestige institution like academia, and then just claim they are deferring entirely to that institution for the justification for their innovation. So since academic prestige is very fragmented and siloed, then the research they fund is going to be very fragmented and siloed because they're just very deferential to academics. So that gives you a sense of what government can and can't do in these sorts of contexts. Government mostly isn't very willing to sort of take chances about things that might not work and then sort of put their own reputation on the line. But if they've got a very prestigious institution that is willing to put its reputation on the line, government is happy to just back that.
Okay, I mean, that ties into the a post that you wrote on overcoming bias, which I posted to from the document, and there you wrote why government does stuff, and I think just generally, could you maybe kind of like summarize where in particular can we kind of like expect government involvement to be more versus least?
I made that comment because I knew it would lead into what you're asking me about. But if we just ask in general, what does government do? We can identify a bunch of different correlates of things government does. The main one that is correlated with it being really useful is scale. When there are clear scale economies, like with supplying electricity or water or sewers or something like that, government tends to do that, and we tend to accept them doing it, and with some sort of regulation. But then there's a whole bunch of other correlates of what government does that seem to exist in the world, and it's less clear whether that means what government does is a good idea. So governments do seem to be less innovative and less flexible in adapting to circumstances, so they tend to focus more on products and services where there's less variety. Everybody gets the same thing in the same way, and they don't change that much over time. Government, of course, focuses on things where it can control, where a regime wants to control and prevent rivals from taking over. So, military, religion, police, law, news, schools, things like that. Government also tends to focus on things where there's norms that people feel strongly about that they want to enforce, where they want to show unity and devotion to each other, where they want the entire community to show off to the rest of the world. So research shows up there in the sense that a lot of the research we do as nations is funded just to show off to everybody else, to say, look how great we are, like say the moon landing or something, not necessarily producing a lot of social value per se, other than whatever is produced by showing off. And of course, government runs things where we want to be hypocritical, where we want to pretend to do one thing but really do another, and the opacity and complexity of government tends to protect that. So Those all don't necessarily give you a clear message for COVID. Clearly, in a crisis like this, people are willing to give government more power to do something, but the government doesn't necessarily have that much freedom to like do something risky or innovative. Government pretty much has to do something with a lot of strong authority and prestige backing. And so that means it might be able to do things fast and effective when it's got that strong authority and backing, but for something else that, like say variolation, they're going to close ranks and shut out sort of threatening dispersive opinions and tactics by saying no, let's stick with the authority.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's like a perfect kind of like lead into like now focusing on COVID-19 and this crisis, right? If you like think back, and I think from Jim and Melanie, I would love to hear your perspective from the front line of like vaccine and like therapeutic development, and from Robin and Jim, like more on the kind of like understanding, like the beast from the inside. So what do you think are currently like blatant wrongdoings that were apparent? Like what's the most critical thing that did not work out the way it should have, and where on the other hand are like really good opportunities right now to be speeding up scientific progress? Maybe Melanie, do you want to go first?
Sure. So the FDA process has gotten better recently. There have been a lot of, mostly under Scott Gottlieb. I'm sorry if someone here isn't a fan of him. I am. I think there have been a lot of good advancements around compassionate use and better advancements around safety clinical trials and moving drugs forward more quickly. We had about 10 or 20 years ago a rush of novel antibody therapeutics, and that's where I'm focused right now. And people were, not sure of all the different things that could happen. We had some mistakes in clinical trials, notably an anti-CD28, if anyone was familiar with that, where the entire first safety cohort actually died. It was kind of messy, but since then, we've understood the biologics therapeutics development pathway much better. And I think there are some rules that have been established that we can play by and are actually being exercised right now in this pandemic, such as the convalescent serum is a good example. So I think I read that it only takes 4 hours for a physician to get approval to use convalescent serum in a patient with COVID-19. So that's an example of, understanding the safety profile of a biologic and being able to move very, very quickly in a great time of need. And so that's something that was done right. And I think it's because our technology has afforded us a far better understanding of how a lot of these biologics work. And so I think the FDA has actually done a pretty good job of starting to recognize that. The approval process, though, is mind-bogglingly slow for many of these drugs. And the FDA has recently been relaxing that in this time of pandemic, which is good to see. But it's a double-edged sword, right? Because we don't want to be doing dangerous things that can really turn people off and make people afraid of science and scientific advancement.
Could you be more specific, like both John and Melanie, maybe like what specifically has happened recently that has sped things up?
Yeah, so on May 16th, there was a relaxation of FDA test kits, right, for whether or not you're going to be seropositive for COVID-19 antibodies or SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. And that led to an absolute flood on the market of test kits that were really poorly validated and poorly verified, and people were quite desperate to get them. Lots of false positives. I'm not sure about the level of false negatives of these, but that has perhaps been the basis of some poorly done studies that made news headlines, and it just ends up really confusing people who aren't in the sciences, who don't have good validation of what's going on. So if you think you're seropositive and you go back to work and you're not, you could end up, really infecting your whole family. So things like that, I think it is good that we get validation and verification. But it is also nice to see that they're trying to relax the standards to make things go quickly. So that would be an example of kind of a double-edged sword there.
Okay, thanks. John, would you like to chime in? And then Jim?
Yeah, sure. I can give another example. Obviously, being Canadian, there was a big approval of a Canadian company with a rapid testing for COVID-19. They weren't asked though to do a real-world clinical validation test. Turns out their technology worked perfectly, but the swabs they chose, to collect the sample were faulty, and the real world gave a lot of false positives. So I think this is an example of how so we need clear guidelines in place of how to use these things clinically. But again, there's an opportunity here to be a lot more creative in the way we demonstrate that validity. And I think that's really what we're thinking about right now. For instance, Aegis Biodefence, we're developing a genetic vaccine against COVID-19. We're also thinking about using the technology to develop, antibody-based neutralizing antibody therapeutics. We're encountering an institution where the average approval time for vaccines is up to 50 years. So I've tried to quote 5 to 7 years, and optimistically. But if you look at traditionally the approval time for vaccines, a quick approval is like 12 years. So and then we're encountering on the technology side these amazing technologies that allow us to sequence all the genomes present in the world within a month and get an initial sequence in less than a week. We have the ability to do machine learning to develop candidates with unprecedented speed, and we've seen companies sort of rise to this challenge. Companies like Moderna, CureVac, and BioNTech with their genetic messenger RNA-based vaccines, and our company working with a breakthrough DNA delivery technology that has allowed us to go through now over 30 candidates and test them in less than a month. But now we're facing a regulatory environment where we have to think about how we're going to take this rapid development prototyping idea and apply it to patients. And so these conversations, so I guess the really positive thing about the pandemic as far as regulatory goes, everybody's open to talk. So we've had frank conversations with the FDA, frank conversations with Health Canada about what they want to see, so the kinds of things they want to see. They've also demonstrated a willingness to look at data as it's emerging. So, for instance, to get to the nitty gritty, whether we want to create a vaccine that has a neutralizing antibody response. We know with COVID-19, one of the dangers that we saw for the SARS vaccine was antibodies can potentially create an antibody-dependent enhancement response that actually makes it worse. So we need to think about incorporating the newest science into our interventions to incorporate that, or think about the key validation studies we need to do to exclude that possibility.
All right, thanks. Yeah, that was quite a laundry list. Jim, what's your angle on this? What has, where do you think have we failed kind of like grandiosely, and where do you think are kind of like holes or loopholes opening that we could really exploit right now?
Yeah, so the biggest failure was over nucleic acid testing. So in January, when it was obvious that this was going to be a pandemic, Germany had widespread testing and were able to identify cases, people that had symptoms or thought they might have been infected were able to get a test. The US was obviously a very, very different story, and that's because of FDA's attitude towards testing, which actually got worse at the end of January and created a monopoly on testing and gave the monopoly to CDC, which unfortunately bungled it. So we lost months. Even today, 4 months later, lots of people who want to test can't get one. And we should have had widespread access to testing in January, which we could have had if we had a different regulatory environment. That's the biggest one. Obviously, the world would be very different. America would be very different if we had widespread testing in January, if labs were able to look at the sequence of the virus and build a test, which many, many labs were capable of doing, except that it was made illegal. Secondly, there's the issue of masks and respirators. So there were two problems there. Three problems. One was that all the stockpiles that were held in preparation for emergencies, from the Strategic National Stockpile that CDC keeps at an undisclosed location, to various state stockpiles, didn't have enough masks and respirators. notoriously, California used to have a huge medical stockpile that included mobile hospitals and ventilators, and it was scrapped a few years ago. So there was a shortage of government backup PPE. Secondly, getting more was made illegal by a lot of ways. One is price gouging laws, which prevented a market from working. Second was misinformation, telling people that they're worthless, which the Surgeon General and CDC said. And the third problem was the slowness of FDA to approve supplies that have been intended for use in workplaces as opposed to hospitals. So they're roughly equivalent. They're respirators. They're made by the same company to the same specs. But if they have the FDA seal of approval, it's legal to use them in hospitals. If they have the NIOSH approval, they're intended for use in workplaces, places that work with a lot of dust, for example. And it took the FDA a long time to say, okay, you're right, they're the same thing, you can use them in hospitals. That delay really cost us a lot. And then there are KN95 respirators, which are also very closely equivalent, which took FDA even longer to allow. So we really lost essential months that we'll never get back because of a very, very heavy regulatory regime.
All right, thanks. Any positive streaks where you actually saw like things in the government opening up, or like just being like, I think Eric Wenson has this like wartime analogy, like things just have to work and they have to work fast. So are there any kind of like holes for innovation where you think we should be like pushing a little bit more to hold those open?
Yeah, so HHS has done a lot of great things that are deregulatory in the past few months. A lot of them relate to telehealth, so the ability to practice medicine over computers or telephones. This had been a pretty small area of medicine before the pandemic. HHS has thankfully waived some HIPAA privacy requirements, so basically allowing a doctor to talk to a patient on the patient's computer, even if the patient's computer does not have special HIPAA compliant software. That's been excellent. Medical practice laws have been relaxed, allowing doctors who have a license in one state to practice in another state, both through telemedicine and through just like getting in their cars and driving to a hotspot to help out. It's kind of sad to think that that has been illegal. This was also an issue people might recall from Hurricane Katrina, where doctors in Houston wanted to get in their cars and drive to New Orleans and treat patients, and it was illegal for a while. So the government has been quite good at waiving a lot of these laws. In San Francisco, the mayor reduced the hiring time for nurses. I believe it was from 9 months, and she reduced it down to I think 2 weeks. So that was a great innovation, absolutely necessary. And of course, it raised the question: why did we have these rules in the first place? And can we keep these this new status quo after we get through the pandemic?
Yeah, I think I want to open that question just because, we've already touched on that up to the panelists of like, which of the things that are currently possible that weren't possible before, do you actually think are promising to keep beyond the pandemic? And if so, what if anything we can do about that? Is it like lobbying, advocacy? Is there any like particular thing that you'd like to draw our attention to? Maybe Robin, do you have one? Or
I would say it probably mostly depends on public visibility. That is, when you can get your doctor to video with you now, then if they try to change the rules back, people will go, what the hell, because they've seen it before. But other more obscure things they don't have much experience with, those could easily reverse.
All right. So maybe maybe then it's upon the folks at the front lines of developing those vaccines to be really vocal and very thankful right now, very publicly about being able to save so many lives quicker. John and Melanie, do you have any input on where do you think could we be pushing? John, you had your hands up.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things we've been looking at as we're designing our phase 1 and phase 2 trials, particularly phase 1. Phase 1, I mean, obviously regulatory framework is all about safety first. And in vaccines in particular, especially when you're going to be vaccinating potentially a very young population, safety is critical. But the thing is, phase 1s have been remarkably inflexible in the past, although this is beginning to change. We have the technology now to evaluate, say a number of vaccines in the phase 1 stage, but then gather an incredible amount of information that we couldn't gather before. We can sequence the complete immune profile of the patients and look exactly what epitopes in that vaccine are having a positive or a negative effect on the response before we even challenge that patient with the disease. And I think being able to create an iterative process in the clinical phase, I think we have an unprecedented ability to do it now, and I think it behooves us and ideally in conversation with the regulators to start doing that.
Yeah, I think John's absolutely right there. When you're running a phase 1 or a phase 2 clinical trial, introducing scientific logic into what you're actually seeing and using that to make your next choice and your next decision is something that seems to be the FDA seems to be more open to hearing about it. And I realize I haven't introduced exactly what we're doing, but we're developing anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies, human antibodies, and we have 50 in our preclinical pipeline right now that we're vetting for binding strength, et cetera. But we've got 50 hits that we're moving forward against the S1 and the S2 proteins. And as we're designing our phase 1 clinical trials, we're introducing a lot of the phase 2. And so we're looking at doing a joint phase 1, phase 2. And not only, so phase 1 is safety, right? And phase 2 is safety and efficacy. And then phase 3 is just a much larger safety efficacy study. But looking at the phase 1, phase 2 combined and using that as a platform to go directly to clinics is something that I think the FDA is far more open to right now, just because we are in a time of prescient need. And keeping that door open as long as we can demonstrate true safety and a version of efficacy that we don't know how long it's efficacious, but if it's efficacious for now, maybe we buy ourselves some time. I'd love to see that happen more with diseases that are pandemic or have pandemic potential.
Thanks. Yeah, Jim, any sweet spots that we should be kind of like pushing for right now?
Well, I firmly believe that we are not through this pandemic, that people should be still staying home, working from home where possible, wearing masks, social distancing. But that doesn't mean I'm a fan of heavy-handed government enforcing that. So what we started to see in the last 2 weeks is people just pretty much ignoring government in terms of sort of going about their lives. And while I think they're very misguided and dangerous, I do see a silver lining, which is people ignoring unconstitutional laws and kind of being civilly disobedient. I sort of admire it from a political perspective.
Yeah, we had an interesting salon that the second one in this workshop series was about how we can champion civic responsibility, and it was but potentially setting up legal defense funds for helping folks who practice civil disobedience to save lives. And yeah, I think one thing that has come to, I think has been popping up a lot now has been kind of like a quest for a vaccine Manhattan Project or a call for something like an ARPA-H. Are there any kinds of efforts in that regard that you think we could now be pushing for on the government level? Maybe Jim first, then Robin, Melanie, and John, if you have an answer to that.
Yeah, so it already exists. It's called BARDA. That stands for the Biodefence Advanced Research and Development Authority. It's an agency inside ASPR, which is the Preparedness and Response Division of HHS. I helped create ASPR 15 years ago and served on the steering committee of BARDA. Normally it has a budget of about $500 million a year. and it invests in development of vaccines and other countermeasures for pandemics and bioterrorism. And so I mean, I think it should be bigger, but it does already exist. We don't need to create a new entity for that.
Okay, and so just what's the bottleneck there? More funding, more flexibility, different people?
Both. I think it should have more funding. I also think FDA should have more funding. And I think we need less regulation around development of vaccines and antivirals and other countermeasures.
All right, thanks, Robin. Then Melanie.
Oh, may I just respond to what Jim said? Sorry to interrupt you, Robin.
Sure.
Yeah, we've had direct interactions with BARDA and DARPA on these things, and we encounter the same problems that you would academically with NIH. There does seem to be a lot of siloing and shell games and horse trading going on. So as a smaller company with validated results, we've actually found it quite difficult to interact with them and get through the noise. I imagine they are inundated, and we've had some calls with program managers, but the same kind of wait and see, let's back it when it's proven kind of attitude does seem to exist in those organizations. And hopefully something like this will shift that, or we'll get some real visionaries in place who can start shifting that.
All right, thanks. Yeah, Robin?
I've been hoping to see some movement along the human challenge proposals. So we saw a lot of op-eds, a lot of discussion, but as far as I know, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, there have been none of them have actually been approved, and the variation that I've been interested in, variolation, would actually be tested by some of those human challenge trials and is in a sense blocked by the same obstacles. So from the medical ethics point of view, they've sort of held the line so far by holding the same standards about what kinds of risks people are allowed to take. So from that side, I report not exciting, hopeful progress.
All right, thanks. Thanks, John. What about you?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So obviously BARDA is a great organization to be looking at this. It's under their purview. So DARPA is another agency that we've been interacting with that also has some interest here and has been thinking about this for a while. This is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. So they've developed programs, thinking about rapid response in the field, being able to rapidly prototype either vaccines or countermeasures to, conceivably biohazards, but could be applied also in pandemics. And they've backed a couple of very large horses that you've heard of. Moderna is one of them, thinking about this idea of creating rapidly prototypal nucleic acid medicines that are built on a platform technology whose safety is largely already proven, and then you're left with quickly prototyping something that's customized for a patient. I think this is exactly the field we're in at Aegis as well. We're able to rapidly prototype DNA vaccines or countermeasures as well. So we're both looking at Moderna and their success and their rapidity to the clinic. With enthusiasm. We know that there's a substantial part of the sort of established institutional population that's also kind of hoping that they'll fail. And we don't. We hope they're absolutely successful, that they have a countermeasure that can be rapidly scaled up. Because the ability then, these kinds of rapidly prototypal platform medicines, you can think of them on a wide scale. We can produce hundreds of millions of vaccines in a short period of time. But I think the more exciting thing potentially is being able to customize medicines at the bedside, not just for infectious disease, but for many other diseases as well. And I think if we can push forward this technology and establish a regulatory framework where we can make it possible, I think we're going to see a new world.
Thank you. Okay, then maybe in terms of like any last words before we take it to participant questions. So if
there's one thing I think we didn't touch on, if you don't mind me just throwing this out there as a question to everyone.
Go for it.
Yeah, so this is all well and good, and we are hopefully, as John said, going to develop something, be it Moderna, be it our company, be it John's company. But then comes scale up. I don't know if we've ever faced the problem of cohesive scale up at a global scale for something to be distributed as widely as we need this to be distributed. And I don't know what role government can play in that. I don't know if we start looking at programs for mass licensing of open sourcing so each country can produce their own. And I'd be really curious what people think about that.
I'll just mention, because we had firsthand knowledge. So obviously, you may have heard this past week that the Oxford group came up with a vaccine they've shown in monkeys as protective.
Right.
Our group, so we have a GMP manufacturing facility in Canada. We're actually considering and allocating a couple of clean rooms to produce the Oxford vaccine, just in case it gets clinical approval first. They immediately, within hours of us having that conversation with the PI, made a deal with AstraZeneca, and then they stopped talking to us completely. So hopefully AstraZeneca has a better solution than us producing it in-house. But again, this is the kind of thing where things are played.
Right. And these large biotechs do have capabilities to scale up for production, but they are already, producing for their own current pipelines. Are they just going to completely knock those out? And then we have other drug shortages. How do we scale this to global distribution level?
All right. Anyone? Yeah, Robin, go for it.
My colleague Alex Tabarrok has an op-ed in the New York Times in the last 2 days where they and a team of economists have proposed a way to guarantee funding for vaccine production so that these organizations won't wait on getting more sure about these things and can just go ahead and be sure to get reimbursed for doing these things.
Okay.
That's great.
Yeah, good. So thanks. Before we're gonna move on to participant questions in 2 minutes, I want to give you maybe like let's say 30 seconds or so to do two things. As the first thing is what particular area of innovation are you most worried about right now, especially with the costs to the economy of the current lockdown? Are there specific fields where where we're significantly losing time? I think Ray Kurzweil or someone for a while said that, if we set back the economy by that much, it will delay the singularity by that much. I'm not talking in that futuristic perspectives, but generally what should we be worried about? And then secondly, what can participants in this chat do right now after this meeting to hold those doors open to prevent the worst and push for where innovation can be sped up right now? Who wants to go first? Raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll pick on people. Yeah, Melanie, go for it.
All right. I have a little bit less experience than most of this panel on this, but one thing I think that we should be focusing on is prevention, not just therapeutics. And so people have been really scrambling to find a therapeutic, and maybe you're 2 days short in the hospital, maybe 10% of people recover a little bit better, but that's not preventative. And to really move our economy forward, we need a solid version of prevention, be it a vaccine, be it temporary immunity with antibody injections. We need people to be safe to interact with each other in an environment where the virus is prevalent, because the hospitalizations will not be decreased necessarily by a therapeutic, maybe a little bit, but not at the scale that we're going to need to get back to work effectively.
All right, Jim, what do you think?
So everyone knows that that SARS-2, and that is the proper name for it, is most severe in people who are over 50 and with comorbidities. Most of those comorbidities are consequences of aging. And so proper aging research is the best way to reduce severity of pandemics. We're not gonna spin out a panacea in the next 6 weeks, but over the next few years, progress in aging, which is very highly dependent on how many people and resources go into it, can make a huge difference in the severity of pandemics. Secondly, Congress should immediately reform drug and vaccine approvals to focus on safety. They should roll back the disastrous 1962 legislation that created this extensive, expensive, phased drug approval process, and allow companies, if they wish, to make drugs available after phase 1, after safety has been established. Focus the agency on safety. Of course, continue to collect data going forward, but reduce the cost that it takes to get a drug to the market, and the speed.
Okay, noted it down in action items. Great. John, and then Robin. And from Robin, I want to hear also the innovation question, what are we worried about? How is innovation going to be slowed down in the next 30 years? John.
Sorry, I was just living in Jim's world for a second. I was smiling. So no, I think that's a fantastic idea. Yeah, where can we go forward? Actually, leave me for next. I'm going to think about that for a second.
Okay, great. Robin.
I'm worried about how much work we're putting in adapting to this pandemic. That is, you know, a few months ago, we were working on a lot of long-term grand visions for how to make society better. And at the moment, we're all focused on adapting to this particular pandemic, like how far away we're staying away from each other, and we're doing distance learning and all these things. And, you know, if in a year or so this is over, then we're going to go back to the usual world, but we'll have been distracted and delayed from it for a while. And that will have been a big cost, not only the big destruction, unemployment, the bigger economic disruption than the Great Depression, perhaps. And we'll try to be recovering from that. So that's just all a big cost. Some things we will learn and we will take some advantages from it, but I'm mainly focused on this huge cost and can we reduce the cost? Are we going to drag out like lockdowns for years, or are we going to find a way to get past this soon enough before we crush everybody and make them really restructure everything? I mean, like you see articles about restructuring offices and restructuring restaurants, like we're supposed to change everything in society in the next few years to deal with this pandemic. That's all enormously expensive. And, you know, let's not do it if we can.
All right, great. I encourage everyone to read the post on lockdown cost-benefit analysis that you did on overcoming bias. And it's a really good way, I think, for people to be thinking about this clearly for themselves. Okay, great. With that being said, thank you to the panelists. I'm going to take participant questions now. Jared Brown had a question for a while. I'm going to unmute you now, Jared. Direct your question to one speaker, please.
Great. Yeah, my name is Jared Brown. I'm from the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute and the Future of Life Institute. And we've talked a lot about biological threats, obviously, in the context of the current pandemic. But there are other global catastrophic risks, low probability, high consequence events that could occur that we do federal R&D on. And I'm curious for Jim, if you have any ideas about how we could restructure the R&D environment at the federal government to deal with these risks more comprehensively.
You're talking about risks besides pandemics?
Besides pandemics, just generally the low probability, high consequence risks.
Yeah, I asked the question on Twitter a month ago, what % of our defense budget should be biodefense? I was kind of making a point as much as asking a question. So part of our defense budget should be on preparing to shoot asteroids out of the way if they're heading for Earth. And we should really take a risk-based approach to all government spending. Someone asked the question a few weeks ago, has anyone done randomized controlled trials to see if FDA regulations are worth it? And there's a little bit glib, but also pretty fair. So I totally support what I think you're implying, which is we should take a very risk-based approach to essentially every single dollar that government spends and every single regulation it issues. That's sort of done a little bit sort of at the agency level, but not nearly rigorously enough.
All right. Thank you. I'm taking Brian Behlendorf and then Rachel Craig. Brian, I'm going to unmute you now.
Oh, wow. What was the question I asked?
All the way back, you had 3 Qs.
Oh, 3 Qs. Yeah, no, the question was one of framing kind of the difference between, and let me turn my video on a little bit. Hi, everyone. Rather than entering into the frame of more or less regulation, I would really wonder if we could talk about more effective and less effective regulatory processes. Drug discovery, for example, has become very highly bureaucratic and lawyer-driven. A lot of that driven around needing to obtain consent from participants in clinical trials, for example. And there are opportunities for optimization of that path, for sure. Are there other regulatory processes that are, or policies that are low-hanging fruit for optimization and innovation without compromising safety or efficacy?
Who are you directing this to? Anyone want to raise their hand here? Any speaker?
Yeah.
Well, I think, go ahead.
Go ahead, Melanie.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think earlier what we touched upon with the combined phase 1-2 clinical trials and things that have known prior safety profiles that have been demonstrated to be generally safe. We can't find any good scientific reason why they wouldn't be. moving forward quickly with those and relying on our scientific data to make better informed decisions rather than doing incredibly expensive long-term clinical trials that really may not add any data to the decision there. That's all I had to say about that.
I'll just add to that, Melanie. Often when we're thinking about a phase 2 trial, it might take 3 or 4 years to do a phase 2 trial. Science comes a long way in 3 to 4 years. So the hypothesis and prime directive you had at the beginning can completely change over that time. So I think absolutely more flexibility in designing trials, being able to adapt trials as new science comes to light, I think is critical.
I would second everything that Melanie and John said. And then I would also sort of quibble with the very last word of Brian's question, which was efficacy. He asked if there's low-hanging fruit that wouldn't compromise safety or efficacy. I mean, I think the answer is yes. It's the reform I was talking about a few minutes ago. I would have FDA focus on safety and leave efficacy to science, namely physicians and scientists who run studies, as well as drug makers, and have a vigorous debate between all of these kinds of scientists. That's real science. Regulation is not real science, and it's better suited for safety than for efficacy.
Great. Robin?
If you're willing to stand back and look at all the different mechanisms we use in society to deal with various kinds of problems, regulation is just one of many mechanisms we have available. I think we should think about substituting less regulation and more of other things. It's not necessarily about less regulation means just more problems, more taking chances. We could do other things instead of regulation.
Great. Okay, thanks so much. Rachel has a question.
Great. So I think I wrote down my question for Jim, but I'd actually be happy for everyone to answer if they have an opinion. So my question, Jim, is if we reduce efficacy restrictions, what do you think the net long-term effects will be for the industry, and how would you quantify success?
Yeah, I think the effects would be the cost of getting a drug to patients, taking it from an idea to the market would be much lower, and the time would also be much lower, which of course compounds the cost effect. And so we'd see more drugs for more conditions. We'd have a much more robust, innovative drug and device and vaccine industry.
All right, thank you. So I don't know, it's now noon. I have more questions. If any of the panelists need to hop off, then thank you so much for joining so far. I would take another question by David Grossoff, maybe one by Creon, but if any one of you wants to go or needs to hop on a call, I want to be super mindful of your time. Thank you so incredibly much for joining. If anyone wants to stay on, I'm going to take David Grossoff's question, but feel free to now zoom out, and I'm going to follow up with your action items that I'm going to then send to our participants. Hey, I can't thank you enough. I think we squeezed a ton into this 1 hour and really kind of like tiptoed in breadth and then dove down into depth. So thanks so much. If anyone wants to zoom off, that's totally fine. I'm going to take another question by.
Thanks,
yeah, I've got another 5 minutes or so. Yep.
And I've got a grant to write, so I'm going to hop off.
Okay, thank you, John, for joining. And
thank you so much.
Okay, David. I'm muting you now.
Okay. I don't remember which question I was going to ask.
You had a few.
I added a few, but I will say that the most frustrating thing here is that instead of taking pot shots at government as a generality, when what we really mean are specific dysfunctions of this administration, which is run not in a bureaucratic way, but like a court system, it might really help reframe things to discuss things in terms of policy and also examples from history of government being extremely successful in ways that only governments can do in order to reframe the understanding of the potentials as well as the trade-offs. I mean, pointing at a lot of scientists who wasted a lot of time in the lab pursuing, hopeless inventions is is not a helpful way to characterize science. It's also not helpful to characterize government's potential. So government did unique things in developing penicillin, which was a useless lab invention, until a monumental, extremely wasteful effort actually brought it to practice. They threw money at things and yet got the job done. And I think there are many examples like that. And then there are other examples of just policy issues. How are nutritional supplements sold in the US compared to other places over a few decades? And to see how well safety only, efficacy, well, we'll leave it to the marketplace. We'll let marketers and doctors and practitioners and naturopaths and homeopaths duke it out in their great wisdom, and let the information marketplace work itself out. And as you can tell from my attitude, I'm kind of skeptical about that. So, like, what do you guys think, especially Jim, what can government do really well? And when it's done it really well, why has that worked?
Well, I think my best answer would be the one you cited, which is develop vaccines. That's why I was defending BARDA a few minutes ago. And I should have also mentioned DARPA. Luckily, some other people did. Vaccines are probably as close as we get to a market failure in healthcare. The margins are very low. The development time is extremely long. The safety considerations are quite appropriately very high, because when you're developing a drug, your attitude towards safety is, well, it doesn't have to be perfect because you're trying to heal a sickness. But with vaccines, you're proposing to inject it into perfectly healthy people. And so even a small side effect profile is more significant. So while many private sector players, including pharma companies, play a great role in developing vaccines, it's a great example of something where government adds a lot more value than it subtracts.
All right, thank you so much, Jim.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that too. I don't think a total lack of control around efficacy is a good way to go. I'm of the opinion, you're right, that if you open up the marketplace completely and totally to the decisions of physicians and patients, you then open them up to people who have deep pockets and are tremendous lobbyists for their therapeutic, right? So you can have a lot of skewing of opinion and even potentially what data is released if you don't have a regulatory body that's meant to be completely agnostic to whatever market forces are behind it. And so I think supplement market might be a good idea, or a good example there, where it's not really as well controlled and the efficacy studies aren't as clear. Scientists, I think, should be more heavily involved and always involved in these decisions, just because of our training and nature and the analysis there. But I do think that efficacy does have a place in government regulation. It just needs to be readjusted for how we measure efficacy and the speed at which we can decide something is efficacious.
Yeah, Robin, chime in, and then Creon, I muted you. You have the last question.
So obviously the question of more versus less government or more versus less regulation is very sensitive, and everybody's already, knows what side they're on and want to fight about it. I would rather not argue about that. But I think the interesting thing to think about here is, over the last few months, we've seen variety across the world, and we've seen different governments do differently. And I think an interesting question is, what will we learn, and what are people learning? What conclusions are people drawing from the variety of different responses by different governments? And, should we draw the conclusion, which seems to on the surface that we look kind of bad? Our government, our regulation, our governance process has failed us more than others have failed them. And what did they do right that we're doing wrong? I think that's, regardless of what you think about overall government and regulation, we should be trying to ask that question. What did we do wrong? What are they doing right?
All right, thank you. And I'm going to hand it to Creon for the last question. I do have an alternative question if you don't want to answer Creon's, which is, what do panelists think are the pros and cons of Bill Gates' approach to test and prepare manufacturing facilities in parallel? Or you can either tackle that, or you can tackle Creon.
Okay, I have a very specific question that I want to ask if anyone particularly has insight into the medical, big medical system and its relation to government, and that is the following. It seems to me that both in terms of aging, research and health span, and now in terms of COVID as really the icing on the cake or the elephant in the room, it's metabolic disease that is killing people. It's killing them too early. It's making them sick, and it's what's killing most people even before COVID, and most people who are dying of COVID have underlying metabolic disease. Now we have no medical specialty that is a metabolic disease specialist. It's like you got diabetologists and endocrinologists and cardiologists, and yet it's again a cross-disciplinary situation that we have to address here, and the medical system has failed. And is there some way perhaps that government or other sort of large pan-medicine institutions could help fix this? I know it won't be in time for the current fire drill, but in the long term, it is arguably what we have to do to prevent horrible pandemics as well as just general degradation of life in the future.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kriyan. And it dovetails nicely with what SENS Research Foundation is doing. I just posted in the comments an essay about how our work dovetails with SARS-2 or COVID-19, which is that aging is killing all of us. And it's not only killing us at the end of our all too short lives, but also degrading the quality of life. And it doesn't have to be that way. The laws of physics and the laws of biology that depend on them do not make it inevitable. Evolution doesn't even want us to age. And we and a lot of other people in our sector are doing research to change this. I would encourage everyone to get involved. Read the link that I just posted and go to sens.org. Exactly as Kriyan said, it's not going to make the difference in the next 6 months, but it will absolutely provide great resilience for future pandemics. And the time to add to it is now.
And we're going to discuss that more tomorrow. Good segue into that one too. Any last words, Melanie and Robin?
Let's see. One thing you asked about earlier was how we shift the curve to be just a better society and how we respond to things. And I wanted to just add one small thing, was that with this pandemic, we were caught pretty flat-footed, and there was poor information distribution, the bungling of the mask situation. And I think that, in general, having more scientific voices in government and in policymaking is a simple, cheap way to ensure that we get messages out that masks are effective and that there isn't a full month going by where people are arguing about this. And, that we understand what a faulty test looks like as a society. And I think, that's a cheap way to provide some insurance for a society facing something like this.
Neat. Yeah, definitely. Robin?
I'd just like to offer the framing that people often talk about, this solution sounds interesting, but it won't be in time for this problem. I think the biggest positive we can potentially get out of this pandemic is practice for the next one. We should be framing this one as what are we learning from this, such that next time we can be more nimble and quick and better on the response. If we and the public saw that framing, then we would be more interested in not just doing things immediately to solve this thing, but learning about how to better deal with future problems like this.
Totally. Jan Tallinn called it yesterday the minimum viable catastrophe to get our act together for the next one. Okay, hey, I can't thank you enough for staying 10 minutes over. That's insane. Thank you so, so much. I do think participants' questions were incredibly good. Next time I'll just make sure to keep my mouth shut earlier so we have more time to tackle them in the session. Thank you so incredibly much. This was fantastic. I'm hoping to see many of you tomorrow when we talk specifically about aging. Hey, I can't thank you enough, as I've already said now 3 times, but I hope you have a lovely day. And yeah, please follow up with me on anything that you'd like panelists, that you'd like participants to do. And all participants, I'll be in touch after the meeting with an email with follow-ups. And I'm going to say goodbye now to all panelists if they want to drop off. And to all participants, bye-bye. To all participants who want to stay on, now is the time where we're going to do some kind of interactive sharing. And I'm going to, I already shared the link to the collaboration spreadsheet on which you always have time to kind of like fill in your bit of hope. So this is something, you know, where we want to hear from you, kind of like what's the thing that is not immediately obvious, that, you know, maybe can't be put in like in a rational argument chain that excites you about the long-term future, especially now, and that you'd like to share with others in the hope that it can provide like a bit of hope for others, or like, you know, some kind of like incentive or like a little pick me up for thinking long-term, even in those kind of like crushy times. Okay, we have, if you want to raise your hand right now, that would be fantastic. If you want to share one. Okay, we have, let's see, we haven't never heard it from Mark Stove. So Mark Stove, you have your hand up. Is that, I'm going to unmute you now, and you can tell me whether that's to share your bit of hope.
Thank you. So I hear a lot about the difficulty of producing billions of treatments eventually, but I'm not hearing so much about the problem of getting those treatments to everyone in the world. And if we're going to really, you know, try to actually, you know, reach all those billions of people, it seems like there's an economy of scale to not just be looking at COVID-19, but if we can reach all those individuals, this is the opportunity to test for other things, to vaccinate for other things, to educate for other things. So, and it would be an exercise in global cooperation at an unprecedented scale. So I would love to hear some discussion about that.
Do you have any things in particular that you'd like us to do while we're reaching folks with COVID-19 vaccines once they are available?
So from my point of view, it's a matter of looking at the local health situation. And while you're talking to and treating people and testing people, to try to have the most impact you can in whatever the locally most effective way would be.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about contact tracing technologies, I think, in not tomorrow's session, but the one after. And there we're definitely going to talk about, hey, given the fact that, you know, we may get around to privacy preserving contact tracing, what other things could we be doing with a coordination device that allows contact tracing, and how can we kind of like incentivize more decentralized cooperation rather than the one, you know, let's say where we have third-party brokers in the middle. And so that's one thing where we're definitely going to talk like about similar lines. But if anyone here, if any of the participants want to get their hands up to answer that immediate question, raise your hand now and I'll unmute you. You can put your video on, raise your hand. Anyone would like to tackle that question that was just posed? I'm not seeing any hands. If I'm overlooking someone, then please tell me in the chat. Definitely don't want to do that. Okay, well then let's take the next hand. Is there a particular like bit of hope, something that you'd like to share as a participant? Mike, I'm gonna unmute you.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I kind of had a question with Jim and SENS. You're working on these anti-aging methods. Will they be like open source, or is the SENS Foundation going to market them or commercialize them in some fashion? How will they be distributed and made available? Kind of curious too, what kind of time frame are we looking at?
Sure. So we publish papers about our research, which are available in medical journals. But also when we have a technology that reaches a certain stage, we spin it out into a for-profit company. We've done that twice in the last 6 months and expect to be doing that more in the next few years. So our atherosclerosis team invented a new cyclodextrin that can eliminate 7-keto-cholesterol, which is a purely toxic byproduct of oxidized cholesterol. And we spun that out into a for-profit company, a pharma company called Underdog, that is going to continue to develop that cyclodextrin and try to get approval and market it as a therapy for cardiovascular disease and stroke. Another example is our research program in AGE crosslinks developed a therapy that we spun out recently into a company called Revel that is developing a therapy to reverse the stiffening of tissues with age. So those are going to be sort of innovative, but standard model pharma companies developing therapies that will be, put up for sale like other drugs.
And are clinical trials available on those, or can you get early access? Is there any way?
They are both planning to do clinical trials. If you, neither one is in human clinical trials yet, but in a year or so, if you track them on clinicaltrials.gov or on their websites, you'll be able to see what the status of their trials are and what the criteria are for participating in trials. So one is Underdog Pharma, and the other is Revel, R-E-V-E-L. And there's bits about them on the SENS website as well, sens.org.
Yeah, thanks. I just shared Aubrey Gray, Sonia Arison, Niels Regge, and Joe Betzlacroix, who talked about like a few of those, like I think Aubrey mentioned a few of those kind of like developments. It's really cool, man, that you've been spinning up 2 companies like within 6 months with also amazing names. Whoever did the marketing, well done. But Aubrey talks a little bit about those as well in the video that I just posted here at our previous longevity investment focus. By the way, I just want to mention, before the COVID lockdown happened, we had this longevity investment salon. We were hoping to do 4 of those in person. And we're now kind of like probably setting up one very big longevity focused meeting, given the fact that it's now a really good time to push for aging research later this year. So if people are interested in that, like maybe shoot me an email so we can coordinate on that a little bit more, because we had a ton of interest before that, and now I don't think that interest is slowing. So I just want to mention that as a kind of like as a preface, as anyone is interested in joining. Okay, so we have George Obelian here who has raised their hand, and this is probably to share a bit of hope. And then we have next one up, we take Keith Runyan. Okay, George, I'm going to unmute you now.
Thank you. I'm with the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and my bit of hope is that we can learn to take all of what we've learned about how we interact with disease as a human species, and then compare those dynamics to how nature interacts with us and how humans can interact with nature in a way where we don't have disease, where we have longevity and health and vitality for the entire system, interworking into how we feed and drink and breathe and live. And I would love your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Would anyone care to answer that particular question? If so, raise your hand now, either in the video or with the raise hand feature. Anyone want to address the planetary and human body health relationship? Well, we are going to be addressing that at the end of week number 3, where we're going to talk about basically next week we're going to zoom out and talk about global systems and how they are affected, how we can become more resilient on a global scale, both production line, but also in terms of building better and building ecosystems that are just more sustainable for a variety of different risks that we may be facing. So you should definitely please join that week. And then I'm taking Keith Runyan next.
Hey everyone, it's been wonderful checking in on this whole conversation. It's really awesome. I think something that's giving me hope is watching new forms of governance like we're seeing in Taiwan. And new civic tech, the Taiwan is a really cool example that allows for a lot more dynamic forms of governance that are less ossified than the current systems that we have, but are also fundamentally just much more effective. And so I'm really excited to see examples like that, or in Barcelona or in Sao Paulo. There's all sorts of different groups that are kind of rising up, and as the current governance systems that we're running are becoming dysfunctional, we're seeing those kind of rise up. So I'm curious what folks' thoughts are on that. And Also curious about, I feel like the other really positive side of this is that minimum viable catastrophe kind of issue. I think that our systems are fundamentally fragile and that we've been optimizing for efficiency over resiliency and for power over wisdom. And so it seems to me if we're going to bind problems around existential risk, that we need to be moving towards not just more dynamic forms of governance that are able to handle the rapidity of change that we're experiencing now, but also wiser forms of governance. So I'm wondering where you're seeing that and how we can best optimize for it.
Is that a question that you want to address to all participants? If so, participants, please, you're free to raise your hand if you want to tackle that. Anyone want to raise their hand? Feel free to do this now in the video. Okay, putting you on the spot here. So, well, I do think that, yeah, I mean, definitely, that's definitely a question that we're going to basically focus the whole next week on answering, you know, and I think like one thing, oh, actually, let's see. Ted Howard has his hand up here. Let's see. Let's hear from you, Ted. I'm going to unmute you.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, look, I just want to go back a question, really. It was the one that George brought up about the difference between nature's systems and ours. And I just put an answer in the text there, but like natural systems, evolution works by differential survival on individuals. So it's essentially a random search algorithm across the space of all possible systems. And it does the search filtering on differential survival. So we need to take that random search, but ensure individual survival while we're doing the search. So we don't want to have individual death being the selection mechanism. We want to continue our individual existence, but still do random search in a way that is survivable. So that's the big distinction that we need to embody in our systems. And the problem we have is that we have evolved this system of support and information transmission socially, which is our economic system, which is based on a scarcity-based paradigm of market value. And that system fails to transmit information once you have automated systems in place. So we have this system which has worked for us in the past when most things were genuinely scarce, which is now failing us in catastrophic ways. And that is the market-based system. Now that we have this context of having automated systems that can produce all of this abundance. So we're in a time of transition where we have to transition away from markets as a valuation mechanism because it's actually broken our information transmission systems. But we also need to be able to search novel spaces and come up with novel responses because that's the way evolution must progress eternally.
Do you have an alternative that you want to throw out?
Well, we're developing the alternatives in mechanisms like this. We need alternative ways of having multiple independent trust networks and multiple independent information transition systems, which are not based on scarcity-based value mechanisms. So the mechanisms of the market need to be there for things that are genuinely scarce, but we need to have these abundance-based systems evolving alongside. And all of those systems need to be based around individual life and individual liberty. But individual liberty must always be constrained because all systems have necessary minima required to maintain them, necessary minimum boundaries. And so we must constrain our liberty within the boundaries necessary for survival, but no more constraint than that. And that's always going to contain uncertainty. So there's always going to be dispute about where those boundaries lie. And so we're going to have to responsibly engage in those disputes eternally at every new level of boundary we explore. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah. Thanks. I posted just now, or I am in the process of posting one of my favorite articles on Slate Star Codex, which is atomic communitarianism, and I think it proposes like a different, I guess, a different interpretation mechanism for this, which is, you know, like why not have something, you know, like different voluntary communities that coexist with each other, in which different people can associate according to their wishes, and which different people can test and try and experiment with different forms of cooperation. All of that in this, like, you know, definitely utopian superstructure, which has the basic needs covered and externalities covered, so that the different pockets that are doing their own thing and experimenting and innovating in their own ways in this kind of, like, you know, larger evolutionary competition mechanism don't influence each other, and also are not scarce in that way and don't die out. So I always really like that. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that quite eloquent comment. And I am not seeing, I think, any more comments over here. I do want to I think close out maybe with you know,
just one more comment, Alison. Like you said, evolutionary competition. That's a misunderstanding of evolution. I know it's common. I know almost everyone uses competition as synonymous with evolution. But once you look deeply at evolution, when you're talking about new levels of complex systems, all new levels of complexity are based upon new levels of cooperation. So by the time you look at systems like us, and to be a speech-capable human, you must embody at least 15 levels of cooperative systems. It's much more accurate to say that at our level, evolution is all about cooperation. Like, we are fundamentally cooperatively based. And this idiot meme that came not from Darwin directly, but from his bulldog, that it's all about competition. Like, it's just wrong. It's mathematically wrong. It's logically wrong. At our level, evolution is all about instantiating new levels of cooperative systems, and all the cooperation must be non-naive, because naive cooperation is always vulnerable to exploitation. So you have to have the evolving ecosystem of cheat detection and cheat removal systems. And that's always an evolutionary ecology in itself, every level. So it's this amazingly complex system. And it's just mind-numbingly complex and beautiful the more you explore it. But
for sure, I think
to use this idea of competition, it's just, we've got to get away from it. It's evolutionary cooperation. That's our survival strategy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think if you talk about reciprocal altruism, you know, that's definitely, I think, one way in which we have evolved tremendously. And I think that you can ultimately also kind of like acknowledge that that still exists in an ultimately evolutionary framework, and the better cooperators survive in that regard. So I think, you know, yeah, I think it depends on what level you analyze the system. But you know, even for that one, I'm going to post another one. Another Slate article, Slate Codex article on meditations on Moloch, on you know, multipolar traps that arise in our long-term trajectory, which I also really like. So anyway, okay, now we're exactly at 12:30, and I'm seeing from Keith like a few thumbs up. I'm guessing that's on the article that I posted. So thank you so much for joining, everyone. This was really quite fantastic. Thank you for staying on for so long. Thank you for being so proactive. We're definitely going to be experimenting a little bit more with making those chats at the end interactive. If you have specific ideas for how to do so without crashing Zoom, please reach out to me. If you have specific requests on what you'd like to do, let me know. Okay, for that, I want to thank you all for joining today. I'm hoping to see many more of you tomorrow when we're going to talk specifically about aging, which has always been very, very close to my heart, very close to Foresight's heart, I think, since forever. And now really there seems to be this unique opportunity to actually make a case in the mainstream for this not to be like this utopian dream, you know, that we want to get to, but actually make a case for, you know, very many things that we care about are kind of like correlates or are, you know, are late-term results of not tackling the root cause of those issues, which in many cases is aging. So thank you for joining tomorrow. Thank you for joining today. I'm going to follow up with more information. Also, here's my last words. Today is Giving Tuesday. weird, right? It's usually after Thanksgiving. Well, we're doing it a little early. I think Lou already posted kind of like a donation link to Foresight in the chat earlier. You know, I just want to remind people that we are a small nonprofit. You know, we are like, I mean, it's mostly Lou and I really that are steering the ship right now. And we definitely are currently, I think in German, you call it growth strips, which is when you grow too fast that your body can't keep up with it. And we're currently definitely experiencing that on some level because we're really trying to take this global, and we're definitely seeing the potential there. But meanwhile, we're definitely quite constrained by our woman power currently. So if you want to help us with that, and if you can donate, then we're really welcome. Like any type of donation is welcome today, especially on Giving Tuesday. I think it would be a really nice opportunity to make that happen. So thank you so much. I just posted the link to our website with the donation button right up front, and I'm hoping to see many of you tomorrow. I hope you have a lovely day. Bye bye, everyone.